Welcome to Civic Warriors, brought to you by Witham. On this podcast, we bring the conversation to you, sharing engaging stories that motivate and build consensus in the nonprofit community. This podcast is about the innovators, the leaders on the front lines of adversity, guiding lights in the nonprofit industry affecting change. And through their stories, we can all join forces to become Civic Warriors. Hey Warriors, welcome to today's episode of Civic Warriors, brought to you by Witham. I'm your host, Brad Caruso, leader of Witham's not-for-profit practice. Today's guest is Stephen Rosenbaum, Executive Director of the Sustainable Media Center, a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. SMC's mission is to act as a catalyst for change, partnering with Gen Z to give them agency over the digital world they navigate, create, and influence every day. From social platforms to generative AI, today's digital environment shapes how we connect, communicate, and understand what's true. SMC believes young people deserve more than protection. They deserve power. Through tools, funding, and cross-generational support, SMC helps Gen Z lead the way, guided by a framework they call social intelligence, technology built with values, purpose, and human insight. In my experience, SMC has been at the forefront of the discussion surrounding the use of social media and its effects. And I personally have had the pleasure of working with Steve and the organization to see how they went from starting out to seeing all the great work they're doing to seeing all the change that they're bringing to the world, and the attention they're drawing to solve a real world issue that exists. And with all that said, as I mentioned, I'm really excited to have you here, and welcome to the show, Steve.
I am so glad to be here. We could not be recording this at a better moment in history because we've got a problem, we've had a journey, and we're just on the cusp of maybe a solution, which is awesome.
Yeah, which is awesome. And I'm excited to get into that because I think much of the world that I speak to, I don't know, has full insight into everything going on. And also the journey that you've been on at the organization, the journey the organization's been on, and kind of how all of that hard work is really coming to light and coming to fruition, solving, as you said, a big challenge and something that affects many, many people.
So when we started, you would go to a cocktail party and you'd say to fellow parents quietly over in the corner, like, are you dealing with this social media thing? And like, if they were friends of yours, like close friends, they would go, oh my, you have no idea. Like I'm struck. And parents were struggling in hiding because first they thought it was their kid or just their problem or they could fix it. And then there was when we started to get to know each other, you could hear parents starting to kind of align. And then young people get involved. And the thing I'm sure of in your audience is we have lots of people that have teenagers and they have not solved it by any means, but they know they're not alone. And that was really our first mission.
Love it. Yeah. And I know from my experience too, I know when I first met you, it was kind of my first foray into it. And yeah, I said the same thing. I'm like, I don't know much about it, but like I'm a parent and I'm concerned. Like there's actually like a real concern for me, or there's real passion that I have for some of the things that you were talking about. So, why don't we start out? Maybe share a little bit about your background, share a little bit about why you founded Sustainable Media Center.
So, my wife and I are serial entrepreneurs. We've started 5 companies, all in technology, media, storytelling, journalism. As with all entrepreneurs, we've had some exits that were pretty good. We've had some exits that were smoking holes in the ground. And so we bought our last company from Senator Cory Booker, and ran that and sold it. And my wife said, listen, 5 is my limit. I'm going to go and get a real job now. And actually she went to grad school. And so I was, for the first time in my career, kind of not out on my own, but, I got hired by NYU and was running the media lab for 6 universities, which was great. I mean, the students were great. The faculty was great. The universities were great. And people started coming to my office and saying, what are we thinking about social media? And I said, oh, what do you mean? Well, we're kind of seeing some data that says it's actually really harmful. And, Scott Galloway, who's at NYU, and Jonathan Haidt, who's at NYU, were early advocates for paying attention to this thing. The more I looked at it, the more I saw data that said, not only was it bad for young people, but it was getting worse and going to get worse without some really systemic change. And it also became clear to me that the changes weren't going to come from inside the university. So SMC began with 20 people on a Zoom call 3 years ago. And we said, we think we've identified a problem that needs attention. And we've, I've never said it quite this. We fumbled around for like the summer. We were like, well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe it's a law, maybe it's changing advertising. It wasn't until a young woman who had come to one of our organizing meetings kind of took me aside and said to me, as only a 21-year-old can, this is never going to work. And I said, oh, no, we're really just getting started and we're going to get organized. She said, no. She said, you're not listening to young people. And we know the problem better than you do. And we have the tools to solve it. And so I said, well, okay, what do we do to change that? And she said, the organization has to be intergenerational. And, I'm a pretty well-read guy. And I had never used that word in a sentence, intergenerational. So we started recruiting young people to the board of directors. And very quickly, the dynamic between what we now call our X+1 crowd, Gen X+1, and our Gen Z crowd was really exciting and often collaborative and occasionally quite contentious. And that has, that energy is at the core of the organization. And our Gen Z board is incredibly active. And we'll talk a little about that in a minute. But parents are concerned. Young people are more concerned. And that's really, that's at the core of the organization.
And it's interesting because young people are probably the most affected. And I think that is very fateful and positive that you had that conversation at that time to connect the dots, because connecting everybody's voice on said issue definitely probably opened your eyes to a few things, I would imagine, or open the door to what the true issues really are. So
I remember vividly being a 15-year-old teenager, and I think most people remember. But when you get to know young people today, and they open up with you in a way they don't with their parents or their coaches or their teachers, and they say, "This is what it feels like to be living in this digital world with this amount of hate, misinformation, anxiety coming at me." There's a moment when you hear that a couple of times and you just think, people, being a teenager is always tough. All teenagers go, no, it's really different now. I mean, you and we were never the target of advertising. I mean, maybe toys or games or some Saturday morning cartoons, but they are so targeted, and it is and this is part of what we're learning from some of the discovery and the trials we're involved with, so purposefully damaging. I mean, to make these kids vulnerable so that you can sell them stuff. I'm hopeful that in our lifetime, we'll look back and think, boy, I'm so glad that we saw that and we're part of getting that to stop.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, without a doubt. So I guess diving into, I think we've been talking a little bit that, there has been an issue in the world. SMC has been advocating for it. You're clearly passionate about it. Can you go elaborate a little bit more about, what is the true issue you're advocating for? And how is that issue? You've made a couple comments to me in the past about how the issue we're dealing with right now is analogous to, what the cigarette industry went through years ago. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the matter itself as well as the analogy there?
Sure. So get in a time machine and go back to the 50s. I mean, cigarettes were cool. Cigarettes made you sexy. Cowboys smoked cigarettes, and girls liked men that smoked cigarettes. And not only were they part of our culture, you could argue that in some ways they were our culture. And I need to confess, I've never smoked. But my friends who have tell me that just knowing what to do with your fingers once you stop smoking. And they were also wildly profitable. So when the research started to come out that cigarettes might actually be bad for you and be killing people and causing cancer, the result of the cigarette industry was to push back passionately on, buy research and hire scientists and run advertisements. And even once any reasonable person, when you think about it just logically, I'm going to take this thing called my lungs. I'm going to breathe into it carcinogens, smoke, nicotine, and it's not going to have a negative. And then, by the way, my grandfather is going to die of lung cancer. I mean, the data went from being early to being kind of irrefutable. And the big tobacco companies fought back passionately. So where are we in social media? The early days of Facebook. Let's argue that Mark Zuckerberg was a harmless kid at Harvard. And then it was kind of lovely. Then it was like, you can see your friends' baby pictures and you can go on vacations. And I mean, there was a whole chunk of social media which made us feel more global, and we get to see other people and we learn other things and learn hobbies and all of this stuff. When it started to turn dark was when advertisers said, we pay per click or per impression. And Facebook in particular, but all of the social networks in different ways, figured out that they could do these things to make you engaged. And, Scott Galloway has this phrase, engagement equals enragement. Like, you don't mean to get drawn into arguing with strangers about politics, but it's very hard to look at, fine, or pretty pictures of animals. But what happened to social media was that they learned the tricks to make people stay on the apps longer required a shift from conversation to addiction. And for a lot of parents, particularly when they look at the data around their teenagers and they see that their kids are on social media 5, 6, 7 hours a day, there's just I believe we will look back as we did with cigarettes and say, that was insane. Like there's nothing healthy about that. And so really, the addiction parable is pretty credible. And by the way, if you say to a young person today, as I do, and when I get to know them, there used to be a time when you could smoke on airplanes. They almost inevitably say to you, you got to be kidding me. A metal tube with no air circulation and people smoked cigarettes on air? Yeah.
I mean, you had to tell people to not smoke in the hospital. Think about that one.
Yeah. I mean, think about all the places where cigarette ashtrays were built into cars, where cigarette lighters were built into car dashboards. I mean, these were great, big social phenomena. And by the way, the reason I say that to your listeners is we're not going to push a button and be out of this. Addiction is profitable. Go to Vegas and see the people in front of the slot machines, just pulling the handle over and over again.
Yeah, especially if it's not illegal either. I mean, I think that's another, the legal aspect of all of this is certainly interesting. And from my experiences having 2 young kids, I see how it goes from 0 to 1,000. I watched how through COVID, it went from 0 to 1,000 with the usage of social media and other platforms, apps, and mindless scrolling. I grew up in the generation where, Facebook came out when I was in college. And exactly to your point, I was like, this is so cool. My friends that go to other colleges, we can share ridiculous pictures with each other, and now when you say looking back, I'm like, I really hope all those pictures are deleted because it was dangerous. But I grew up around that where it was like, we were just, as you said, it came out and it was like, oh, this is awesome. I have this opportunity my grandma can now see my pictures of what I'm doing all the time, and I can see her, and it's a great way to connect.
And by the way, I want to be careful not to blame parents because, you go now out to a restaurant and there's a family having dinner and the kid has an iPad. And, maybe 3 or 5 years ago, I would have looked sideways at them. I don't anymore. One of the things about parenting, as a parent of older kids that I remember vividly is there's no handbook. You're kind of making it up as you go along. So, there are parents that say, kids should be off screens. And I'm like, yeah, I got to go to work, and then when I come home from work, I want to put my feet up for 5 minutes. And if my kid wants to be on an iPad playing what I think is a game that I think is reasonably okay, you know what? Don't guilt me on that stuff. I mean, there's a huge issue about screens in schools. And I mean, I've heard every argument there is on all sides of that. And I don't have a good answer to that, except to say this. People wanting to connect with each other is natural and human. And when you put robots and AI in particular in between humans and screens, there is the potential that some really terrible things could happen. And there's some stories to share about kids who fell in love with chatbots and went into a very dark place.
Yeah. How have obviously there's a couple things that we're talking about here, and there's a couple, I think, key aspects to why some of these things have carried on for several years. In basic terms, how have the social media companies kind of avoided, let's just say lawsuit for lack of a better word, how have they avoided being pushed back upon for some of this behavior that's, clearly producing negative results?
So go in a time machine and go back 20 years, and Congress did something that was uncharacteristically smart. They added to the Communications Decency Act something called Section 230. And Section 230 said, if you're a publisher of other people's content, you're not responsible. And arguably, the internet would not have grown into the powerful thing that it is without Section 230, because it was essentially a get out of jail free card. And at the time, if you think about what would have happened to the phone company if every person who said something bad in a phone call, the phone company was liable for. If you used a phone to call somebody and say, we're going to rob a bank, or all kinds of nefarious stuff happens on phone calls, as well as lovely stuff. And so that idea that social media platforms were pipelines, but not publishers, made absolute sense for maybe 10 years. And then in came the platforms to start to say, we're going to choose what videos, instead of when Facebook went from all the posts being chronological, which is the last thing the last person in your community said was at the top, to these algorithmic things where they could choose what to push up. They effectively became publishers. And as we know from Washington, laws don't change very often. And so Section 230 went from being this get out of jail free card to this really dangerous shield. And, the number of companies that now consider their existence, their future existence, and the ability not to sue them critical. And that's all Section 230. And there's been a debate in Congress for years about whether or not it should be sunset or rewritten. And it is interestingly pretty bipartisan that Section 230 needs to change, but they've never gotten around to putting a pen to paper about how to change it.
Yeah, when you first explained that to me and I first heard about that, I was like, I think there's parts of it that say there's a necessary reason why that exists, but also then, there are some reasons why it probably went a little farther than that. And very, very interestingly, although that offers protection, I think, even since we started to plan to have this discussion, you mentioned to me that there's some recent things that are going on that are starting to, change that dynamic a little bit. Can you share a little bit about some of the recent news that's been going on?
So there's a growing community of parents who've lost children, and they claim due to the impacts of social media on their kids. And it's teen suicide numbers that are horrific. And as an outsider, when somebody says this terrible thing happened in my family and I blame Facebook, there's a tendency to say, well, there must be things we don't know. I mean, the family must have had other stuff going on. But if you talk to enough of them, as I now have, which is hundreds, the patterns are almost identical. And the stories individually are heartbreaking. So there's an organization based on the West Coast, the Social Media Victims Law Center. and they have been collecting cases that parents wanted to file against these platforms. At the same time, state attorney generals have been gearing up to file cases. There were 2 cases in the last month. One was a state case filed in New Mexico by the state attorney general, and the other was an individual young woman and her family filed in Los Angeles. Coincidentally, they were both going to the jury on the same day. And coincidentally, the juries both came back with verdicts 2 days apart. And so the first verdict that came back was New Mexico, and it was guilty on all counts against the platforms. And I didn't know that case as well, but obviously we were very excited about that because it was the very first time and I'll talk about the LA case because that's the one I know better. Laura Marquez and her team from Social Media Victims Law Center came up with a novel claim. And the claim was that it wasn't that the platform's content was responsible. It was that the platforms were engineered to be addictive. And it was not a Section 230 case. It was a product liability case. And no different than the Ford Pinto, or no different than, you bought a baby carriage and it hurt your child. Like product liability is a very well-known area of law. And because I'm not a lawyer and don't claim to be one, I can't tell you why there wasn't a product liability case filed against a social media company before this. But what happened in the case, and again, a bunch of things tipped our way. First, the case was really good. Secondly, when Facebook filed essentially to have the case be stopped early, the judge let it move into discovery. And once we were in discovery, the evidence that we got, particularly out of Facebook, but also out of YouTube, was so damning, like so kind of irrefutably damning, like documents from Facebook saying, we're doing great, but we really have to focus more on getting 13-year-olds. Like, hard to moonwalk your way out of that word. Like, wait, children that are 13 years old are business targets of your company. And that was never the case in history, by the way. I mean, going back to the way television was legislated, you could not target children for ads. So when that case came back from the jury, it was guilty on all charges. Facebook was guilty. YouTube was guilty. Snap and Pinterest had both settled, so they were out of the case. And Facebook's insurance company said to them, not only are we not paying out this verdict, but based on the evidence we've seen, we think that this was willful neglect, and we're not going to defend you in any of these cases going forward. Well, there are 2,000 cases lined up to go against these social companies. Now, I want to be clear for anyone of your listeners who's read a little about this. The sideways glance is the jury verdicts were actually not huge numbers, right? So if you're Facebook, you could say, look, we're just going to, we'll basically just fight every case and settle for a couple $100 million. They still make so much money that this alone, I don't think, is going to make them change their business. But the parents, what's interesting about the parents who slept on the sidewalk in front of the courthouse in Los Angeles for a week, they're not backing down. This case is the beginning of a movement, and that's exciting.
It is. And it's also, I mean, it's, if you read into the facts and like you said, if you hear the personal stories of how, people were affected, it's horrifying. And then you hear, like you said, the key of this is not necessarily always the end result, but the discovery came out where, all of these facts came forward, and it's like, yeah, actually, like you were intentionally doing this, and that, going from accidental to intention, or, that's a big deal in the world. And when I hear that, it like I said, I have 2 young kids, and it just like horrifies me. I'm like, that's your target.
And by the way, here's the thing that's changed between your parents and my parents and the parents that are dealing with this. Like, at the end of the day, the parents of a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old, if you invite, how old are your kids?
7 and 9.
So if you invited me to your 7-year-old's birthday party, and I stopped over at Barnes & Noble and picked up a present, and it said on the box, 16 and up, and I brought it to the birthday party wrapped in, and your kid opened it and said, "Oh, thank you so much," and I bought them, you would say to me, "Steve, he's not 16. It says right on the box. A science experiment with chemicals, not appropriate for my 7-year-old, and go take it back." And as a parent, when the 7-year-old becomes 10, I would bring a 10-year-old appropriate present when the 10-year-old becomes 15. And every year, and kids are different, a 15-year-old, some are much more mature than others. But like at the end of the day, parents should have the ability to give their kids access to information, devices, presents that are age appropriate. And the fact that at the moment you have none of those controls on the internet, like that's unacceptable. And I will never bring your child a 12-year-old present to a 7-year-old birthday party.
It depends on what it is. Maybe it's a good baseball bat that he needs.
But if I wasn't sure if it was age appropriate, you and I would have a conversation.
We would have a conversation about it, and we would have the opportunity to have, parental choice. I think that's an important aspect. It wouldn't
be a drum set.
Right.
I did buy my brother's son a drum set one year.
Oh, did you? Oh my gosh. Yeah. So that's awesome. And also for the brother, probably like, why would you do that to me?
Yeah, it was a brother thing.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt. Yeah. Yeah. My brother has a kid that's a little bit younger than my kids. So yeah, we definitely exchange gifts with our nephews and nieces.
Parenting is hard enough as it is. And kids living in the world we live in is hard enough as it is. The fact that, my younger son is a middle school teacher, and he says kids come to school and want to talk to him about what's going on in the war. These are little kids, but they have iPhones or phones at home, and they're seeing images and they want to understand it. What do that's just not conversations you should have to have with little kids.
It definitely increases the complexity of their youthful development. And I hear the same thing. My kids get off the bus, and some of the things I hear, I'm like, where did you hear that? That's a little bit of a dangerous thought.
To be fair, I don't mean to sound like I don't think we're going to get in a time machine and go back to a sheltered childhood, where kids don't have access to what's going on in the world. That ship sailed. But I do think parents having control over their kids' digital life is entirely appropriate.
Definitely. So that's a lot of, good background information. I think, you certainly have kind of brought us up to speed on some of the matters that you've been addressing. Let's talk a little bit about Sustainable Media Center as a whole. Talk about some of the projects you have ongoing. Talk about, how has Sustainable Media Center as a model as a whole evolved? It's been around for a couple of years now, and it's obviously evolved probably based on, several relevant factors as the world has changed. But, talk a little bit about SMC and some of the great work you're doing.
So it's interesting. The young woman who runs the Gen Z advocacy side of the organization, Emma Lemke, is an extraordinary advocate. She's testified in front of Congress. She's been on 60 Minutes. She's a very high-profile, thoughtful young woman. And when we sat down just before the end of last year and looked at where we were going, we said, first of all, there are lots of organizations now focused on pieces of this issue. Where do we fit? Where is the special sauce where we can add real value and we're not just copying someone else? And 2 things became clear. One, the intergenerational nature of the organization makes us unique and distinctive. So you're going to see more media coming out of us in the year ahead, which is going to be the Gen X plus crowd and the Gen Z folks talking to each other in conferences, at conventions. We're right in the middle of recreating our website video about our mission, and it's now going to be an intercut between people of different generations. We know that we do that better than anyone else. So when people say, how does this affect young people? We're the people that people are now calling saying, so when Jonathan Haidt was working on his next book, he reached out and said, I want to talk to young people about phones. And we put together a immediate Zoom call for him, recorded it, published it with him interviewing mostly 20, 22-year-olds about where social media fits in their life. I think it made his mission with Anxious Generation stronger. And I know that my young people learned a lot from talking to him. So those intergenerational engagements are going to be core to what we do going forward. Secondly, we think we have a unique ability to sit in the middle of conversations between, different organizations, parents on one hand, tech companies on the other, teachers and classroom advocates on the other, and be able to bring them together. Because we're in some ways Switzerland in that regard. We had a Zoom call with the lawyer from the LA case 3 weeks ago. And on the call was the lawyer who fought the case, Jonathan Haidt, and Frances Haugen, who was the Facebook whistleblower, all of whom talking to each other. Couldn't have been prouder of being able to convene that conversation. We're going to begin doing a monthly newsletter, publicly available free, called Scorecard, because there are now so many lawsuits and so many actions that when somebody cares about this issue, we want there to be a center point of gravity where they can get data. We're not naive. We're going to lose some cases. We're going to lose some appeals. There's questions about where the Supreme Court is on the horizon. To be clear, we stay out of politics. We don't endorse candidates, but we do think that being able to show people once a month, here's what's changed, and by the way, the media coverage of the LA case was enormous. That's not going to happen again. Like Facebook loses court case, every media company on the planet covered that. But when Facebook loses the next one, or it's a mixed decision, it's going to end up on page 37, not page 1. We know that. So we think that being able to give people information to keep them engaged. We're planning a big event with a high-profile speaker and a really important date and a location, which I can't yet tell you because we're in the process of just putting the details together now. But it'll be our first big, hundreds of people who care about this issue in the room together. And then the other thing is we don't think that the social media platforms go away, but we do think that, right now, if I say to you, find a piece of software that you're comfortable sharing with your kids, you'd be hard pressed to find choices. And so part of what we want to do is amplify new growing experiments for parents of younger kids. So you know what? All your friends are on this. I can keep an eye on it. The other parents are okay with it. What's the word I've heard? Tweens, right? Is there any product out there for tweens? I don't believe there is. But we know of some in development that we want to support. So the organization has always been, since you've known us, fundamentally optimistic. We don't think that technology is going away. We're not Luddites, not anything like that. But we do think that when you think back to when cigarettes were made essentially illegal in public spaces, smokers were outraged. It was a civil rights issue. You should be able to smoke in bars. You should be able to. And then all the smokers were standing out on the street in the cold, shivering and smoking their cigarettes. Guess what? Transitions are hard.
We figured it out. I'm not a smoker, but I do remember being working in a restaurant in my youth years where there was a smoking section and a non-smoking section. And being a teen in the smoking section, you'd go home and you would smell like an ashtray. I remember being like, this is bad. This is not great.
But when you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem like it's ever going to change.
No, because it's such a large scale issue. It's not an issue of flipping a switch or doing X, Y, and Z. It's a large scale cultural movement that exists. That's not an easy thing to change.
Tristan Harris was a friend and a colleague. He was one of the early fighters of the impact of social media, and he's now talking almost entirely about AI. And there is no doubt that some of the lessons we learned from social media, we need to learn about AI before it becomes harder to reverse.
Oh, without a doubt. And this is one matter, but the core issue itself is going to continue without having some level of change occur. And, on that topic, and, I think everybody hears the word AI and wants to learn more about it. And, for yourself, I was really excited when we had the conversation. You have, if I'm understanding correctly, a book coming out soon, which talks about AI a little bit. The Future of Truth, How AI Reshapes Reality. Talk a little bit about your book that's coming out. I already ordered a copy, full disclosure, and I'm very excited to read it.
So I began writing it 5 years ago when I was in grad school studying truth. For the first 2 years I was writing it, it was entirely about information and facts and sources. And then AI, which had been in the lab for a very long time, kind of burst onto the public scene with OpenAI and ChatGPT. And I remember going to my thesis advisor and saying, I really think that the truth story without AI as kind of the mitigating factor is not as interesting. We rewrote the thesis. And so the graduate degree became a book. Sold the book 2 years ago. And it's been an exciting time to be in the AI space because, just to be entirely blunt, I don't believe that we should put the genie back in the bottle. I don't. I think that AI is incredibly exciting. And, if you use it at all in your daily life, there are certain things it does so quickly and so effectively that you find yourself thinking, I'm never going to have to do that manually ever again. But, when people talk about AI and hallucinations, that word is a very forgiving word. If I say to you, I'm hallucinating about, where we're going to dinner, it's kind of funny. If I say to you, I'm lying to you, and so, to talk about the world you live in, when you talk about numbers and people's accounting and their taxes and where the money comes from and how it's being, like the idea that I'm going to let a robot do that work for me and be right 70% of the time and then dangerously wrong 30% of the time. For a lot of people in professional services businesses, whether it be law, accounting, advertising, media, I don't think we've come to terms with the fact that part of what the book talks about in chapter 7 is, what do we do when AI lies? Well, AI lies all the time. And if you know developers as well as I do, one of the things they'll tell you kind of off the record is, we don't know why it says the things it says. If you've ever tried to use AI to do word count on a document, it's often shockingly wrong. Like a 300-word document, it'll come back and say 4,000. And you're like, that's not a typo. That's just so part of what the book does, and I hope you find it, it's meant to be fun and engaging, and it has 8 great, big, fabulous interviews with really thoughtful people smarter than I am. But at the end of the day, the real thing that I would say about AI's relationship to social media is we have an opportunity right now to say to these companies, we want you to be transparent about what you're building and how it behaves and where it gets its data from. And we don't want you to do that behind some iron curtain. Any more than if you did our taxes and I said, how did you get to this number? And you say, well, Steve, we really can't tell you that's a proprietary thing, but you just have to trust us that it's right. I would be like, yeah, no. Part of what we love about math is that, it is very much subjective truth. 1 + 1 = 2. And the book was written, I was at an event 2 weeks ago in Vancouver, and I hosted a dinner about the future of truth. And I expected it to be a nice little when I showed up at the restaurant, there were 80 people had made reservations, and it was sold out. And it was fascinating. Everybody feels strongly about truth and how much it matters and how to talk to kids about it. And the next day I walked around the conference. For the very first time in my life, I felt like what it felt like to be a rock star. And people came up to me and said, that dinner was so amazing. And I said to them gently, thank you, but I invited people. But all I did was was say the word out loud and say over here. And so I hope that you will read it and enjoy it and say to 5 of your friends, hey, there's this great book that I read. And they'll say, oh yeah, I know I'm really busy. But then they'll be like, I am a little worried about where AI is taking us. And maybe that's a fun, interesting way to explore it. So that's what it is.
Definitely, and I'm excited about it. I mean, AI is probably the biggest buzzword in the accounting, audit, and professional service firm world right now. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know what it means or its intentions or how to use it in the correct way. But it certainly is a topic of conversation, and there's every news article that I've read in the last month says how AI is going to, they're already, all the big firms are replacing people with AI and they're downsizing and they're doing X, Y, and Z. And to your point, I have the professional skepticism to say, well, hold on a second. AI is a tool just like anything else. It's a technology, in my opinion. But there's no real framework for it. And, you're seeing reports being published with errors in them as a result. To your point, there's been a lot of public articles about hallucinations and, the sources, when you check into them, don't have factual information behind them. So, from your perspective, we do have to get to the point of, what is the framework of truth? What is the framework of reality? Because if you get away from that, now you're into another dangerous territory, or at least in my opinion, you get into a very dangerous territory of what is the objective truth.
One of my friends runs a very big law firm, and he said the thing they're struggling with is there used to be all these entry-level jobs. And, as someone, when you do one of those entry-level jobs, it's a lot of scut work. It's fact-checking 500-page papers for periods and commas and typos. So all of a sudden that work goes away because you can have the robot do it. But then you have no need for entry-level employees who learn other things about the culture of your firm and how lawyers interact and mentoring and all that stuff goes away because you don't need the first year and the second year employees. How does anyone get experience if they don't come in and start at the jobs where you bring a clean shirt to work?
No doubt.
So one of the chapters in the book is about the future of work. And we did a long interview with Andrew Yang, and Andrew Yang's vision for the complexity of AI and the impact on employment is quite nuanced and a little terrifying. And he uses as an example truck drivers. When you look at the number of people whose livelihood is driving a vehicle, whether it's a Uber or whatever, or a truck, and you take them all and you replace them with automated driverless trucks, you end up with tens of thousands of people for whom there is no other job. So, we'll retrain them to do what? What you've hit upon though, and for listeners who've stuck with us, my whole career has been about, I love change. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not a slow the trains kind of guy, but I do think this particular change may happen so quickly. If you are unemployed and unemployable at 50 years old, and thanks to medical science, you're going to live to be 80, that's a whole lot of people that need to find another way to earn a living. And, I haven't found a way to circle that square.
I don't know that anybody has or will. You're talking about a systemic and drastic change in a society, and millions of people having to reinvent themselves, or millions of people having to reinvent what they do just because we rolled out a technology that replaces them. It brings up, in my opinion, it always brings up this core question of why? Why do we need to do that? And I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't, but I always get back to this. I grew up on watching The Matrix, and this is always probably a bad example for some people, but for me, I always watched that, and just this concept of The Matrix itself in the movie, it terrified me from then out. And I'm progressive and definitely adopt technology, and I'm all for it. But that's always in the back of my mind. I'm I'm going to be a battery one day. It's a terrible thing.
So there's a philosopher in the book. He talks about the philosophy of AI, and his question, which he asks readers, is, aren't we already living in the Matrix? And as I interviewed him, it's funny, another NYU professor, I guess maybe there's a theme here. I realized that in my head, I was staging a debate between he and Plato, David Chalmers and Plato. And so I thought to myself, well, now that I have the technology at my fingertips, so I went on to ChatGPT and I asked it a bunch of questions, and I asked it to use the questions as the basis of a debate between David Chalmers and Plato. And it's in the book. The debate between Plato and David Chalmers is fascinating.
Oh, awesome.
But, but if you were worried about, being a battery, you might want to skip this chapter.
Nah, I'm fighting it with full steam ahead. It's fine.
He's a delightful guy, brilliant philosopher. But he basically says we're in the make. And by the way, to be fair, as we sit here talking, I'm pretty sure it's you, and I'm pretty sure you're a person in front of a video camera and a microphone, but it would not be technologically very hard for you to be AI. Reid Hoffman has ReadBot, and ReadBot, it's not clear to me whether he makes it slightly not believable on purpose so I can distinguish between real Reid and robot Reid, but it's pretty darn close.
Yeah, robot couldn't imitate me. It would just say illogical. Like it wouldn't. There would be no like if I remember I once did a disc survey and I was like right in the middle of the disc survey. I'm like, am I a sociopath? like how did I get in the middle of this survey? So yeah, AI can't replicate me. Not possible.
I'm buying you that T-shirt. You're going to go to the beach this summer and you're going to be wearing a T-shirt that says, "Am I a sociopath?"
Am I a sociopath? And it's just the picture of the disc survey.
That's very funny.
I can be whatever personality profile you want.
I have never taken such a survey, and I don't think I ever will.
I was forced. I had to. I sat through a business development seminar, and the first thing they had us do was that, so that, kind of teaching the principle of like read the room and understand the profile of the person you're talking to so you can kind of adapt to their style. And then, I filled it out, and they're just like, we don't know what to do with you.
But the other thing I would say to your listeners is they've tuned into this because they're in the not-for-profit philanthropy space. And there's a real question for all of us about what do people need? What can our organizations provide? For a young organization such as the Sustainable Media Center to evolve its mission statement was, I have to tell you, a painful process. But it became clear to us that we were born out of a need, and then the need space grew dramatically. And just by way of example, there's a website called Character AI. And a young man named Suel Seltzer, who was 15 years old, went on this Character AI website and began to have a relationship with this AI character and fell in love with her, it, them. And that relationship devolved, and he became depressed. And the AI finally said to him, "You should come be with me," and ended up convincing him to commit suicide. And that's now in court. The family is suing. But, and it's unclear who owned. So Character AI was a spin-off of a product that was developed at Google and then went off and became private and is now back inside Google. And they claim that they've adjusted the algorithm. But it's worth saying out loud, if I said to you, never use the word purple on your podcast starting tomorrow, you could write a little note to the editor and say, anytime anyone says purple, just cut that out and make sure any conversation about purple. And that would be a very easy instruction. And your editor who pays attention would find the word purple. In AI, that's not how code works. It's not like don't do this action or don't say this word. So saying to it, this is, we get into a little bit of Isaac Asimov, here, don't hurt the humans. Like, don't let the robot hurt the humans. Well, what if the logic is that the human is unhappy and the best thing you can do to solve their pain is to take it away? Well, no, like that judgment about what hurt is Do you know the famous AI story about the paper clips? There's an experiment in which a scientist told a particular developer to manufacture as many paper clips as it could. And the AI went out and just took every car and building and piece of cement and food stuff and remanufactured them all as paper clips until the only thing left in the world was paper clips. Like, those instructions get analyzed and parsed in ways that may not have a human component to them. So I do think this is a time for some real thoughtful conversation about truth and about outcomes, and not just, if all the company wants to do is use AI to reduce headcount, and it reduces the headcount from 1,000 employees to 0, because the robot can do all the things the human does. But then as a result, there's no customers because you've removed all the customers from the planet. Like, would it be great if taxes were simpler? Yes, it would be great. If I could push a button on the government website and have it do my taxes automatically for me and nobody in the tax preparation business had a job anymore, would that be great? That would not be great. And would I trust the government to push that button? No, I don't think I would. Some of the adversarial nature of these things is important, is I guess my point.
The real question is a philosophical one. Should we? That's the debate I have with myself of, what is the right answer? There is no right answer, but should we, what path should we go down?
Well, and here's an easy way to test that. So let's say, Brad, that we go out to lunch. And when the lunch ends, I say, hey, Brad, I'm really strapped for cash and I got to get home. Can you loan me $20? So we know each other a long time, and you say, yeah, you should do a wallet. You hand me $20. I said, you know what? I'm going to give you back $200 in a week. So a week goes by, we see each other. I hand you $200. I say, you want to do that again? You kind of look at me quizzically. Say, okay, you hand me $20. I go back a week later. I come back and give you $200. This goes on for 2 or 3 weeks. And finally you say to me, I don't quite get it. I mean, $20 a week later, I'm getting 10x my money. Like, I said, oh, Brett, I buy and sell heroin. So you're giving me $20. I'm going to the corner. I'm buying $20 worth of heroin. And then I have a network where I sell it. And I'm getting back actually $400. So, like, you want to do it? Can I have $20? Well, now you know how I've 10x'd your money. All of a sudden, maybe you're not loaning me $20 anymore. Right now, no one's asking the question. Hey, AI. Well, what are the outcomes? Let's get in a whiteboard and say, if it really replaces all the jobs on the planet, except ditch diggers or, whatever physical things it can't do, except robots probably can do those too.
It's not going to want to do public accounting either. So it's like client service. It's going to explode.
It's very funny. There was a robot at the TED conference, and his name was Butter. I think it's his. And his operator came up to me and said, you want to take a picture with your book and Butter? And so we took a picture. And I said, can he hold it? And the operator said, yeah, no, we don't have him. He can't really hold anything. I'm like, really useful robot. It can walk around clumsily, but it can't actually hold anything. So it reminded me that I'll put that up on Facebook, because where else would you put up a robot holding my book? But no, the should we question is the right question, and it's not being asked now, and it should be.
I think it's the right, I in my opinion too, I agree. I think that it's the right question to ask, and not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent. I think it's just understanding that there are some systemic effects on society. There are some things that really drastically affect us, and we should understand those long-term implications of some of these items. A lot of, where we started with this, that there's long-term implications to technologies we use, and then, bringing that forward to today. And, AI is the big topic of conversation, but it is great that we can find a tool that can solve certain challenges, but there also are equal and opposite reactions to those items as well. So we talked about a lot today, Steve. We definitely covered a lot of ground. Clearly, you are a civic warrior in the world. You're doing a lot on this topic. How can the public help you at SMC continue to do the great work that you're doing?
So go to the website, sustainablemedia.center. the website has a lot of information on it. There's a newsletter you can read. You can sign up. You can join the board of advisors if you've got particular sector expertise. But then there's kind of a larger philosophical thing you can do, which is, and I'm waiting for this to happen. I'm trying to will this into reality. We all buy soap and, toothpaste and whatever. We buy things, we purchase things. I think that there's going to be a movement where the money that goes into these social platforms doesn't get printed on like it's coming from brands who used to care about, I want my brand to be in a clean, well-lit space. I don't want to be near anything negative. And they've given up on that for the time being. And I'd like to see customers begin to say out loud, you know what? I really like Dove soap. I like their body positive advertising. And when I go to the supermarket and I have a choice between Dove or the store brand, I'm going to pay the extra 10 cents because I'm going to start endorsing consumer products that behave properly in the world and treat myself and my family and my children and my teenagers fairly. And that's going to have to go two ways. Brands are going to have to be more explicit about what they do and how they care for their customers. And customers are going to have to start making kind of judgments about where the reason why I'm optimistic about that as a phenomenon is Gen Z has a phenomenal economic impact that they haven't yet put to work, but they're right on the verge of it. And there's some examples I can't talk about yet that are beginning to bubble up. So those three things: get involved, join, read the newsletter, talk to your friends. Don't feel guilty. Don't say, I feel so bad that I can't take all the stuff you're going through with your teens. We're all going through, not just you.
It's an important thing to always remember. You're not alone.
Absolutely not. Thank you for the work you do. I mean, with them and your engagement in Civic Warriors and all of us, it's it really matters to have this support and to not feel alone, because the finance side is hard. It's hard and complicated and puzzling. And so thank you for being a supporter of all of our work.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I was very, very happy that it's very funny too. I ran into the partner that introduced us. Chris DeMeo, who's our leader of our technology practice, introduced us several years ago. And I was just sitting with him. I'm like, I'm doing a podcast with Steve today. He's like, let's tell him I said hello.
He's great.
He's awesome. And it's crazy how far it's come. But I love doing the work too. I love hearing everything you're doing. I've been to a couple of the activities that you held. Definitely, I do the accounting thing on the 990 side, which is fun to people like myself. But yeah, it's been a pleasure knowing you, learning about the organization and being involved in it. And where my job started getting really exciting is how I've been getting very involved in just understanding people's missions better and being able to share their missions. We've had made such an impact on that front, and it's very exciting to do that. So I appreciate you sharing your voice and your ideas. It's been great.
I got to be honest, I've never heard the word 990 and fun in the same sentence ever before in my life.
Yeah, that's why I said the computer would explode if it tried to replicate me. It'd be fun.
Well, thanks very much.
All right, Steve, thank you. And Warriors, thank you for listening. Subscribe and meet us right back here for another episode of With Them Civic Warriors. Bye, everybody.